enjoy this tour of one of the scariest U.S. cases. In central North Carolina, we'll enter the Appalachian cold shadows. There was snow, silence, and a mystery in 1898 that haunts that remote area's records. Let us know where you're watching, and get ready for this story to reveal 100-year-old secrets. End of the 1800s, and the Appalachians in North Carolina were very different. Charlotte and Raleigh were modernizing with electric streetcars and telegraph lines, but in the scattered mountain communities, people lived like their ancestors 100 years earlier. The roads were dangerous and wound through centuries-old pine and oak trees. These trails were dangerous in winter due to ice and frozen mud. Western North Carolina's Madison County. One place where time stopped was Carolina. Just over 15,000 people live in deep valleys and misty peaks. The county was known for its small tobacco farms and higher ground mining. Marshall Village, the county seat, had 300 full-time residents. It had one main street with weathered wooden buildings and a stone courthouse that handled all local justice. Marshall received Margaret Crowe in fall 1897. Nobody. She knew where she came from, but later records suggest she left Virginia after losing her husband. Margaret was 35 and always wore her dark hair in a bun. Her neighbors said her eyes were frightening. She rented a small log cabin on the south slope of Mount Mitchell, 5 miles from the village, from local farmer Josiah Hendress. Even then, the cabin was rough. 2 main rooms had leaky logs. These walls let cold air in at night in winter. The stone fireplace filled most of the wall. A small cast-iron stove and oilcloth-covered windows were also present. Margaret occasionally sewed clothes for Marshall's wealthy families to pay her $2.50 rent. Sewing and embroidering were her strengths, but she rarely talked about her past. Margaret appeared to seek solitude in her first months in the area. Herself. She bought essentials at Solomon Green's General Store in Marshall once a week. She always paid with carefully counted coins. Solomon, a 60-year-old who knew everyone in the county, would tell his wife that Margaret's eyes looked strange and unsettling. Other residents felt uneasy, but no one could explain why. In 1897-1898, winter was. It was worst in the Appalachian Mountains. From early December to March, it snowed non-stop, forming chest-deep layers in some valleys. Trail-making was impossible for weeks. High-altitude families were isolated and survived until spring on dried food and smoked meat. Margaret Crowe received visitors that harsh winter. Josiah's wife, Sarah Hendress, who lived on the main street, noticed first. This farm is about a mile from Margaret's cabin. Emma climbed the hillside to bring Margaret apple preserves one January afternoon as a neighborly act. She saw a man leave her property. He hid his face with a thick overcoat and wide-brimmed hat. Greeting Emma, he waved briefly and continued walking down the trail. Over the next few weeks, Emma saw people come and go, always men, alone, and at dusk or early evening. She informed them. Josiah casually said Margaret was probably meeting sewing clients, but Emma wasn't sure. The way these men got there was dangerous. They always went at night to avoid detection. Thomas Whitfield visited Marshall in February 1898. Thomas sold patent medicine in mountainous North Carolina and Tennessee, selling tonics, elixirs, and ointments that may not have worked. He was known for his loose tongue and frequenting local taverns to trade rumors and stories for food and drink. After a few corn whiskey shots at Henry Bolton's tavern, Thomas criticized Margaret Crowe. Thomas claimed to have stayed at Margaret's cabin 3 nights. He described it as dark and stuffy with tallow candles burning in makeshift candelabras and a sickly sweet smell he couldn't place. He said Margaret could do more than sew. Lady told fortunes and made herbal remedies for various illnesses. Even whispers said she offered other services that Thomas didn't say, but made clear with knowing laughter and sly looks. Marshall was inundated with rumors. 3 Baptist churches competed for churchgoers in a small religious town. People's doubts about Margaret became damning certainties. She was a woman without a family who lives alone in the mountains and entertains men at night. Some residents thought this proved the person was immoral. Reverend Ezekiel Morrison first criticized Margaret Crow. Marshall's Mount Zion Baptist Church had 150 regular members, and Ezekiel was its pastor. He was 42 and had a chest-length beard. He was a fiery preacher who argued. He called sin and evil. Ezekiel preached a sermon that many attendees would never forget after Thomas Whitfield rumors spread. He mentioned Margaret without naming her, but everyone understood. Ezekiel shouted that women were vulnerable without husbands or fathers, and that impurity was spreading through clean communities. He said the congregation needed to be purified before contagion spread. His voice. His Bible reading about temptation and penance resonated off the church's wooden walls. Several sensitive women sobbed after he finished. Not everyone in Marshall supported Reverend Morrison. A few people defended Margaret's peace. They included 53-year-old widow Sarah Pritchard. Her Main Street boarding house was small. When Sarah met Margaret months ago, she had a dress fitted, and they talked about how hard it is for single women in a male-dominated world. Sarah did not see Margaret as sinful. Instead, she saw a struggling woman. Several people defended Sarah. The county doctor, 61-year-old Philadelphia Medical School graduate Dr. Benjamin Clark, advised against hasty conclusions. Margaret saw Dr. Clark after cutting her hand badly working with. He found her nice and smart while fabric shopping. He warned the public that rumors and gossip were not proof and that they should not be used to damage someone's reputation. Though moderates tried to speak out, anger drowned them out. Margaret's situation worsened by March 1898, when the snow melted and the trails were usable. Important church leaders pressured Solomon Green. Members informed her that his store could no longer sell her food. Josiah Hriss stated that he would not renew his cabin lease, which expired in April. Margaret was powerless. She had no food or shelter in a few weeks, so she had to act fast. Sarah Pritchard refused to let her rent a room at the boarding house because it would hurt her business and reputation. Protecting someone the community considered bad. Even though it hurt, they had to tell each other the economic truth. Sad hugs and tears ensued. Margaret made a life-changing decision. She searched Marshall for County Sheriff William Dockery in the 3rd week of March. William, 39, had briefly served in the Civil War Army as a teenager. He defended Madison law with a realistic, firm mix. Margaret filed a formal complaint in his small first-floor stone courthouse office. She claimed she was mistreated and that the rumors were false. She claimed her safety was threatened. Margaret showed William rude letters from strangers. She was called a witch, threatened to burn down her cabin while inside, and told she would never find peace in Madison, the letters said. The words were disturbing, but the anger made me sick. Margaret spoke while William Dockery remained silent, a serious face as they read the letters. As a police officer and member of this community, he knew how tense it could get when outsiders broke the rules. He assured Margaret he would investigate the threats, but his body language suggested otherwise. William spent a long time looking at the papers after she left his office. Advice for sitting at his desk. William visited Reverend Morrison that night. The pastor's study was lit by oil lamps as 2 men discussed Margaret Crow's case. The Reverend saw that the woman was getting what she deserved. The community's righteous anger was due to her immorality. William, who was more cautious, worried about violence. He had seen small-town mobs form quickly. How anger can turn people dangerous when they gather. Reverend Morrison assured William of no fighting. He promised a normal Christian response from the church. Margaret would be isolated from people and money until she had to leave. Moral and business pressure would suffice to avoid physical conflict. William was still tense after that conversation. No legal reason to do otherwise. The following days were calm, but not. Margaret rarely left her cabin. Emma Hendris checked on her neighbor up the hill despite her husband's advice because she was curious. Margaret sat outside the cabin, looking out at the Appalachian Mountains in the blue haze. The women briefly spoke. To thank Emma for her kindness over the years, Jane told her something. Would always remember that mountains hide secrets, some of which are too heavy to carry. Emma was chilled, even though she didn't understand Margaret's meaning. Their finality reminded me of goodbye or conclusion. She felt bad walking back to her farm on the trail. She had a vague feeling that something bad was about to happen, but couldn't pinpoint it. Hendris visited Margaret's house in the morning of March 28, 1898. Cabin to discuss lease termination details. He repeatedly knocked on the door without response. Despite trying to hide it, Josiah opened the door. It opened easily and wasn't locked. He opened it and found something that changed that community forever. One of the most disturbing North Carolina Appalachian cases began. It seemed like Josiah Hendris stood in the doorway forever. But it was probably only a few seconds. And his brain was having trouble understanding what his eyes saw. The cabin was messy. Broken dishes littered the wooden floor, and torn fabrics hung from shelves like ghosts. Still, the stone structure that covered almost the entire north wall of the main room caught his attention. It was the fireplace. There was fire. It was late in the morning, but there were still a few bright embers, and a strong and unpleasant smell permeated the air. Josiah walked slowly with his sleeve over his nose and mouth, creaking the floorboards. He was furious looking into the fireplace. The ashes and burned wood contained pieces he couldn't identify. It didn't look right. It looked unlike wood or fabric. Josiah was rushing away as his heart raced. He phoned Margaret to find her. The cabin was empty when I weakly called her name. The second room, their bedroom, looked abandoned. The bed was unmade. The small trunk where Margaret kept her clothes was empty. Only the mess was visible through the broken wall mirror. No longer Margaret Crow. Josiah descended the mountain faster than ever. He almost ran down the slick trail, tripping on rocks and roots. He went straight to Sheriff William Docker's office and told them what he found between gasps. William focused more as he listened. He asked specific questions about the cabin, fireplace remains, and signs of fighting or violence. After getting his hat and gun, he called his deputy, Marcus Flynn, 23, and they climbed up to the Hendricks yard. The first investigation was done with care for a disturbing scene. William Dockery had little serious crime experience. He mostly resolved fence disputes, arrested drunks, and caught cattle thieves, but he knew he had to write everything carefully. He told Marcus to take lots of notes as they toured the cabin. The body parts in the fireplace were carefully removed and placed in a canvas bag. William saw animal bone fragments too small for humans. He also saw partially burned cloth and charred book or notebook pages, and something that really upset him. Fire had damaged what appeared to be human hair so badly that it was impossible to tell. It appeared that scalp held the hair together. Josiah Hriss watched from outside the cabin and wouldn't enter. His shaking hands showed he was scared as he lit his pipe. He insisted that he should never have rented that place to her because he knew she was troubled. Will tried to cheer him up. He tried to say they didn't know what happened, but even he could tell his words were empty. The search for Margaret Crow began immediately. William organized men to clean up mountain trails. One road went down toward Marshall, one north toward Tennessee, and one east through deep valleys to Asheville, 35 miles away, each group, receiving clear instructions. Look for a 35-year-old dark-haired woman with a trunk or suitcase. She may walk or ride a borrowed wagon. The groups searched mountains for 3 days. Every lonely farmer, every family in distant valleys, and every traveler they met was questioned. No one had seen Jane Crow. She appeared to have vanished into the blue mist that always shrouded those old peaks. The searchers became angrier as it rained. Fall began on day 3. A cold spring rain turned the paths into mud rivers, obscuring Margaret's footprints. Rumors grew like weeds in Marshall after rain. The story about the broken-down cabin and the disturbing remains in the fireplace spread quickly, but like all repeated stories, it evolved. Some said William found full human bones in the fireplace. The walls were allegedly painted with satanic symbols. Some said someone told them Margaret did scary midnight rituals like calling on evil spirits and sacrificing animals. Reverend Ezekiel Morrison took up the chants. He preached even more vehemently the Sunday after the discovery. He said that evil had crept into the community and that the only way to protect them was to stay alert and have unwavering faith. Faithful people were advised to stay alert, report suspicious behavior, and maintain there. Lock your doors and protect your family. Churches were packed that Sunday. The Reverend's words and an explanation for their fear intrigued the crowd in the back and outside. Not everyone thought the story was fake. The boarding house owner, Sarah Pritchard, publicly doubted. She believed the bodies in the fireplace proved no one knew what happened in that cabin. Could be reasonable, like Margaret leaving because she couldn't take the community's harassment. Sarah advised them to consider their actions before accusing a woman who could no longer defend herself. Few supported Sarah's claim. Her Margaret defense made people suspicious. Some said Sarah worked with Margaret and knew more than she revealed, was willing to admit her boarding house may have hosted illegal activity. Sarah wisely chose to keep quiet in public as she felt the weight of being shunned. Dr. Benjamin Clark was stressed too. After advising against snap decisions, some of his regular patients stopped visiting him. To see other doctors in nearby counties, they had to travel farther. Easy to grasp, questioning the official story had social and economic effects. William Dockery received a letter 10 days after Margaret disappeared. Hidden under his office door, it was left overnight with no return address. Unlike Margaret's mean threats weeks earlier, the letter was written in beautiful, firm handwriting. William read the letter 3 times, becoming more confused and uncomfortable. A brief letter, but each word appeared carefully chosen. It read, "Sheriff Dockery, the secrets you seek are not in the mountains, but in the hearts of those who remain. Margaret Crow knew too much, and her silence cost her dearly. Search the county records for the names she never mentioned. The truth lies buried where no one dares dig." There was no signature, no date, just those enigmatic lines written in black ink on fine paper. William sat in his wood chair for a time, holding the letter. His desk, as afternoon sunlight filters through his office's dusty windows. He was a sensible person who dealt with facts and evidence, not coded messages and vague hints, but that letter bothered him. A strong sense that the case had many layers he hadn't even begun to peel. Even though it seemed odd, he followed the letter. William examined county records in the courthouse basement the following day. Were kept. Some shelves were sagging from decades of property records, birth and death certificates, court cases, and tax returns filed by generations of hardworking clerks. The room was dim and damp. William first searched the property records for Margaret Crow. He only found Josiah Hendriss's October 1897 lease. His search expanded to include any paper mentioning her name. He found it then. Something unexpected. An 1883 Virginia marriage certificate filed in Madison for unknown reasons. Margaret and Daniel Crow were married in Richmond, Virginia. Margaret Ashford was her name then. Daniel sold tobacco, according to the document. William meticulously recorded everything in his notebook. However, what he found next upset him. They married 9 years before Daniel Crow's death certificate was filed in Richmond in 1892. Written death cause on paper. Accidental arsenic poisoning. William recognized arsenic. Many people died in accidents while using it to kill pests in tobacco and grain warehouses. The certificate had a handwritten note in the corner. It was hard to read because the basement was damp for years. Richmond police are investigating. No proof. Case closed. A chill ran through William. This warranted suspicion of Daniel. Crow's death prompted a police investigation despite no evidence. He searched the records again, determined. He searched more dusty stacks of old papers for 3 hours before finding something else. Letters from 1897 between Richmond Police and Madison County Sheriff. Richmond Sheriff James Patterson wrote to former Madison County Sheriff William Williams that a woman named Margaret Crow may have moved there. The letter asked the sheriff to quietly monitor her because Richmond police suspected her of murdering her husband, even though there was no evidence. The letter requested notification of any suspicious activity involving Margaret Crow at the end. William examined papers. No response was recorded, and the previous sheriff never acknowledged receiving it. The letter. It could have been lost in the system or ignored by the retiring sheriff. However, Margaret Crow lived in Madison for months without being seen by anyone in charge. William came out of the basement with copies of all the important papers because he suspected her troubled past. He returned to his office, organized his desk, and tried to create a timeline. Marriage occurred in 1883 for Janet. 9 years later, her husband died mysteriously. After 5 years in Richmond, she moved to Madison in fall 1897. 5 years had passed. What did she do? Why did she visit North Carolina's Appalachian Mountains? He needed more info. William wrote a detailed letter to the Richmond Police Department requesting all Daniel Crow death investigation records and any other records. Some Margaret facts. The answer would take weeks, he knew. Back then, counties and states communicated via train and wagon couriers. Though slow, it had to be done. Meanwhile, Marshall residents struggled to return to normal. Despite tensions, people spoke quietly, looked suspiciously, and locked their doors more carefully at dusk. The general sense that the community had changed fundamentally and lost its innocence forever. Bad dreams began for Emma Hendress. Margaret Crow walked through the mountains at night in her dream, and her shape faded into a mist. Emma couldn't sleep after waking up in a cold sweat with a racing heart. No one, not even Josiah, heard her dreams. Her dreams made her sick. She lost weight, her eyes darkened, and she stopped looking at the abandoned hillside cabin. People were morbidly interested in the cabin. Marshall's kids and teens defied each other to go up there at night. To prove their bravery, they would touch the log walls and run down the trail, nervously laughing and claiming to hear strange voices or see shadows in the empty windows. Parents discouraged these trips, but that only made them more popular. Cabins appeal for illegal adventures. Reverend Morrison publicly suggested burning the cabin to clean the area and erase that dark time. Josiah Hendress, the landowner, refused. In spring, when the plants were just drying out after a wet winter, setting fire to a dry wooden structure in the mountains could start a terrible wildfire. He didn't do this because he liked the place. The log cabin. It would remain there as a silent reminder of the spring upheaval. Richmond responded to William Dockery mid-April. The package included the full Daniel Crow death investigation report and other papers. William read harder and took notes as he learned more about the case. Richmond's police report was extensive. It had 17 small print pages. Daniel Crowe died at home on. She died the night of August 14, 1892, after 3 days of vomiting, abdominal pain, and seizures. His doctor initially thought he had cholera, a common illness in cities during summer-contaminated water outbreaks. Margaret called the doctor on Daniel's second day of illness to say she thought it was short-term. The doctor found Daniel in terrible shape, completely insane, with a high fever and no water. The doctor tried to keep the patient hydrated and gave laudanum for pain. The next morning, Daniel died with only Margaret and the housekeeper, Ruth Henderson, an elderly woman. Like most people who died from contagious diseases, the body was quickly buried. 2 days after his death, Daniel was buried at Richmond's St. John's Episcopal Church. The tale may have finished. In a time when infectious diseases killed many, this was another sad but common death. 3 weeks after the burial, Robert Thornton called Richmond police with a terrifying story. Daniel Crowe and Robert were tobacco industry partners for 6 years. Robert told the police that Daniel changed his will 2 months before his death, which Robert found odd. His last will, written shortly after marrying, Margaret left most of her estate to Daniel's family, but she also left herself a lot. In June 1892, Margaret received everything in the new will. Even scarier, Robert told Daniel that Margaret had threatened to leave him if he didn't include her more generously in his estate plans days before he signed the new will. Robert said Daniel loved Margaret but felt conflicted, controlled by her. He said Margaret had kept some secrets from him and that he sometimes felt uncomfortable with her behavior for reasons he couldn't pinpoint. This information led to an exhumation order for Richmond police. 6 weeks after his burial, Daniel Crowe's body was found in September 1892. Medical examiners took tissue and organ samples for chemical analysis. Analysis to a Baltimore lab, one of the few in the area with poison-finding equipment. 3 months later, the results confirmed what people thought. Daniel Crowe's liver, kidneys, and hair had arsenic levels many times higher than expected from the environment. The amount found suggested intentional poisoning over days or weeks, leading to his fatal doses. Margaret, questioned by Richmond police in December 1892. The interrogation report said she was calm and answered questions with a firm voice and direct gaze. She vigorously denied causing her husband's death. It's common to keep arsenic at home to kill rats. She suspected Daniel was poisoned by eating contaminated food or touching arsenic packets in his warehouse. It worked. Margaret referenced the will and said she had told Daniel that it was unfair to leave his wife such a small inheritance, especially since she had run the business for years. She said she didn't threaten Daniel and that their conversation about family finances was normal. The police wanted more proof. Ruth Henderson, the housekeeper, confirmed Margaret's care. Daniel, while he was sick, feeding and medicating him. Ruth didn't notice anything suspicious about Margaret's behavior, but she said her boss locked some kitchen cabinets and only she had the keys. Ruth wasn't sure what was in these cabinets when asked. She only knew Margaret kept her personal items and medicinal herbs for teas and tonics there. The police sought a warrant to search Margaret's home. The judge refused to let them look in these cabinets at his house because vague testimony and circumstantial evidence did not prove probable cause. Margaret was allowed to lock her cabinets, and the arsenic may have been there by accident. But given how much was found, that seemed unlikely. No evidence proved Margaret was the poisoner after months of investigation. Despite witnesses seeing her give Daniel arsenic, the district attorney decided not to charge her. The investigation ended in May 1893 with the note, "Insufficient evidence to prosecute." Margaret stayed in Richmond for 4 years. William's records show she lived off Daniel's inheritance. The large sum Daniel left her included the house, tobacco warehouse, and several investments. Things like, she sold the warehouse in 1894 and sold other properties slowly. She sold the house in 1897 and disappeared from Richmond. William reclined and felt the news crush him. He now understood why Richmond police wrote Madison County. Margaret was no ordinary stranger with a strange past. She avoided murder charges on a technicality and chose a remote area on purpose. New life in the mountains. Avoid nosy people and doubts. But that made things worse. Margaret, if she could poison her husband for money, what else could she do? The cottage fireplace remains took on a new meaning after these new facts were discovered. The people Emma Hendris saw at night and Thomas Whitfield's rumors. William couldn't ignore the pattern forming. He had to act on this new info. William scheduled a court date with County Prosecutor Henry Ashford, a lawyer. Henry Ashford is not related to Margaret, despite their shared maiden names. Henry was 47 and apprenticed to an older judge to become a lawyer. Besides prosecuting, he had a small marshal office where he saw private clients. William showed Henry all the papers and explained his findings. Henry just listened, knowing more about Margaret's past. He knowing more about Margaret's past, he said they didn't have proof she did anything wrong in Madison. The remains in the fireplace were disturbing, but they were mostly rabbit or squirrel bones, which he may have killed, have used for food or legal purposes. The hair found wasn't enough to diagnose with the tools available at the time. When Henry Ashford talked about the law, he showed he knew the problems with the current system. He told William that forensic evidence, witnesses, and a body barred Margaret Crowe from being charged in Madison County, that she had. Though scary, her Virginia poisoning suspicions had nothing to do with the North Carolina proceedings because she had never been charged or convicted. William said to act definitely. A woman with a sketchy past mysteriously vanished, leaving a suspicious scene. Henry saw the issue as troubling, but he insisted that morality did not mean having legal standing. He advised them to keep looking for Margaret in nearby towns in case she returns. However, they couldn't issue warrants or sue. Marcus Flynn, William's young deputy, entered unexpectedly and ended the conversation. Marcus was gasping after running to court, and his first words made William and Henry stand up. The body was found. The three men raced down Marshall's main street to Solomon Green's small, crowdy business. Solomon shook his hand to point to the back of his store from outside, his pink skin as pale as wax. William pushed past the onlookers and told them to stay. He then visited Solomon's small warehouse in the back. The body was partially on the warehouse's dirt floor, bagged in burlap. Miss Crowe was absent. Based on his breakdown, he had been dead for at least a few weeks, possibly since late winter. William carefully knelt beside the body to examine it. He covered his nose to avoid death odor. He appeared to be 4050. His thick beard, dark hair with gray streaks, and clothes made him look like a traveler or temporary worker. His body showed no signs of violence or injuries to explain his condition. Death. The man's pockets were searched by William for identification. His small finds included a cheap pocket watch that stopped at 3:15 p.m. They gave $1.65 in coins and a folded slip of paper with their cursive name and address. In Mount Mitchell, Margaret Crowe lives on the Hendricks estate. The paper altered everything. Harry Ashford and Marcus visited the warehouse and saw William show it to him. Three men gazed deeply at each other. Now they could connect directly. Margaret and a man's death, but they didn't know who or how. People called Solomon Green to describe the body on his land. Solomon looked shaken but told the story clearly. He rarely used that storage room. It was an old building in the back of his land where he stored broken tools and planned repairs. having only gone there that. He searched for a shovel he thought he had stored months earlier. He found the body after opening the door and smelling something. William inquired about Solomon's warehouse visit before that day. Solomon thought carefully before answering that the heavy snow probably started in November of the previous year. No sign of the body, which may have been there since December or January, concealed by snow. People visited the remote building in winter. Investigations gained importance. William planned a systematic search of Marshall and the surrounding area for hidden bodies. He also sent telegrams to nearby counties describing the found man and asking if anyone had reported missing people matching the description. Marcus Flynn had to ask Marshall residents if they had seen any strange people in the fall. Winter, especially dead man-like people. Slowly, responses came in. A man who fit the description was seen in the fall by several people, but his name and origin were unknown. Sarah Pritchard, the boarding house owner, revealed vital information. A man like that stayed at her boarding house for 2 nights in early November 1897. He registered as John Patterson, a spice merchant traveling through the place. He asked Sarah about local women living alone because he was looking for a distant relative who had moved there after losing her husband. Because of this, Sarah remembered him. Sarah, who always helps, told Marshall about Margaret Crow, the only single woman she knew who lived alone in the area. He said he would see her the next morning and thanked her for the information. Sarah's confession started a scary chain of events. A man came to Marshall, especially 2. Margaret Crow, or local single women. He apparently went to see Margaret after learning her location. He vanished and was found dead in Solomon Green's storage unit. The biggest question was whether Margaret killed the man and how and why. Benjamin Clark was called in to examine the body. He worked in the warehouse all afternoon while William and Marcus looked and took notes. Dr. Clark was cautious, methodical, examining every body part that could be evaluated after decomposition. Early on, he thought the man died from poisoning. Even though he couldn't identify the substance without advanced chemical analysis, he reached his conclusion based on several factors. The man's body showed tissue discolorations consistent with poisoning and suggested he died quickly and easily. In particular, Dr. Clark said the symptoms resembled those in arsenic poisoning books, but he needed lab tests to confirm. William and Henry looked at each other knowingly when arsenic was mentioned. They knew what to do. In Virginia, Margaret was accused of poisoning her husband with arsenic. Now, a man who was looking for her was dead, possibly poisoned. The paper in his pocket linked her to the dead man. William decided to expand the investigation. He wrote to Richmond police asking about people who went missing or died strangely while Margaret lived there after Daniel Crow's death. He wrote to counties in North Carolina and neighboring states about traveling men's disappearances in recent months. William watched Margaret's mountain cabin while waiting for answers. More was put together. A more thorough search was conducted to find evidence of poisoning or other foul play. William Marcus and Dr. Clark were part of a 6-person team that inspected the entire property for 2 days. Lots of scary things were found. Under a loose floorboard in the second room was a small metal chest with glass vials of liquids and powders. Dr. Clark examined each vial. He said some were common medicinal plants. Chamomile and valerian help you sleep. After seeing peppermint oil for headaches and digestion, he couldn't see what was in 3 vials. These vials were carefully wrapped and sent to an Asheville lab for analysis. 2 weeks later, we received Asheville lab results. A messenger rode all day on mountain trails and brought them. Henry Ashford and Dr. Clark witnessed William opening the sealed envelope in his office. His worst fears were confirmed by the report. 2 of 3. From unknown vials, white powder arsenic was mixed with distilled water to make a tasteless solution that could be added to food or drinks. The third vial contains strychnine, another powerful poison that kills rodents but can also kill people. The discovery transformed the investigation. Margaret Crowe hid lethal poisons under her cabin's floorboards. Concentrations and mixes that suggested intentional use, not just housebug and pest control. Henry Ashford said this, along with John Patterson's body in Solomon Green's warehouse and the paper linking him to Margaret, warranted her arrest. Margaret Crowe was charged with first-degree murder in John Patterson's death on May 23, 1898. Every North Carolina sheriff received a warrant copy, and nearby states, along with a detailed description of Margaret and warnings that she is dangerous. A $200 reward was offered for her capture. A large sum of money attracted bounty hunters and adventurers, but Margaret was never found. Many weeks and months had passed since anyone had seen her. A woman resembling her was seen in Knoxville, Tennessee, and Charleston, South Carolina, NC, KY, and Louisville. None of these sightings were confirmed. People in the Marshalls whispered that she had disappeared or never been human. The answers to Williams's questions about other possible crimes revealed an even scarier pattern. Richmond police responded with information about 3 missing men over the years. Daniel Crowe's widow Martha lived there. All 3 were widowers or middle-aged men living alone. They were last seen near Margaret's house. They were all wealthy. First was hardware store owner Albert Morrison, who disappeared in June 1893. He told a neighbor he went to Margaret's house for a business meeting. Nobody saw him again. His family reported him missing, but police thought he had left town. At that time, people moved frequently and weren't required to notify the government. War veteran Charles Peyton disappeared in November 1894. Margaret and Charles had been dating for months, and many people had seen them at social events. Charles vanished suddenly. His war pension kept going to his last known address, but he never claimed it. Again, the police believed Charles had done nothing wrong, moved on. Third, March 1896 lawyer Theodore Blackwell was absent. Because Theodore had visited Margaret several times, rumors circulated that he was helping her sell her properties. He wasn't seen for 2 days before a meeting with important clients, something that was totally out of character for a professional who was always very careful about keeping appointments. The bodies of the 3 people had never been found. Each disappearance was looked at as a separate event at the time. There was a clear link between them besides the fact that they were all about middle-aged men in Richmond. But now that time had passed and Margaret's secret was known, the pattern could no longer be ignored. 3 men had gone missing after being seen with her. William told Henry Ashford and Reverend Morrison about this while she was living off of Daniel Crowe's inheritance, and before she sold all of her properties and left Richmond. Morrison had become a powerful voice in the community while the investigation was going on. There was a mix of reactions. Henry stuck to his cautious legal view, saying that disappearances did not prove murder and that connecting Margaret to these kinds of cases without physical evidence would be against the law. But Reverend Morrison got proof of his worst fears when he said in his sermon the next Sunday that evil had really been among them, and that the community had only been spared an even worse fate by God's grace. Dear Reverend, Marshall was deeply moved by Morrison's sermon. After months of nothing happening, the fear that had started to fade came back with a vengeance. Locks were put on doors even during the day. Women wouldn't walk alone at night, and anyone from outside the town was looked at suspiciously and was treated badly. Before Margaret Crowe came, Marshall was a village that was mostly open and friendly. Now it was becoming a closed and scared community. Sarah Pritchard, whose boarding house that relied on tourists and travelers, saw a huge drop in business. Many people stayed away from Marshall because they had heard bad things about the town. People who had to go through quickly. If they didn't have to, they didn't stay overnight. People didn't listen to Sarah when she tried to speak out against the climate of fear. The community needed someone to blame for their fear, and Margaret Crow, who wasn't there, was the perfect person to do the job. A strange thing happened in July 1898, 4 months after Margaret went missing. There was progress. Someone called Elias Drummond, a bounty hunter, came to Marshall and said he knew where Margaret was. In his 50s, Elias was a tough man with scars on his face that showed he had been in fights. He was known for always catching his targets, no matter how long it took or how far he had to travel. Elias met with William Dockery alone and told him that he had found Margaret in a small town called Murphy, which is on the border between North Carolina and Georgia, of the country. Elias said that Margaret was living under a fake name and working as a seamstress for local families. She was trying to start over in a place where no one knew about her past. William quickly put together a group to go to Murphy. He brought Marcus Flynn, Elias Drummond, and 2 other Marshall's men on his journey. Some of the most dangerous trails in the Appalachian Mountains were used on the 3-day trip. They mostly went along in silence, and each man was lost, as he thought about what might happen when they finally spoke to Margaret Crow. Even less people lived in Murphy than in Marshall. It was in a narrow valley surrounded by densely forested mountains and had a population of only about 200. They got there at dusk on a warm July day. The clouds over the faraway peaks were lit up by the sun's golden light. Elias took them to a simple wooden house on the edge of town. The garden was well taken care of, and the windows were covered with white curtains. William rang His hand was on the holster of his revolver as he stood at the door. He hoped he wouldn't have to use it. There was a brief pause. Then footsteps came up behind them. She was there when the door opened. As Margaret Crow looked straight at William, a thought crossed her face for a moment. Maybe giving up, or maybe feeling relieved. Don't think she didn't know why they were there, try to run away, or protest. Her voice was calm and clear as she said, "I've been waiting for you." Margaret Crow did not fight when she was arrested. She only asked for a few minutes to get some things together, which William agreed to. She carefully checked the things to make sure they didn't have any weapons or poisons on them before packing some clothes, a worn prayer book, and a framed picture of what William thought was her and her late husband Daniel looking happy. People in her quiet village started to gather outside as she packed her things because they were curious about the armed men who were there. The lady of the land of. The owner of the house where Margaret rented a room, an old woman named Abigail Foster, strongly opposed the arrest. She claimed that Sarah Mitchell, the tenant, was a good, religious woman who attended church every Sunday and had never caused trouble. William patiently informed her that Margaret was wanted for murder in another county. After hearing this news, Abigail jumped back in horror and covered her mouth. Marshall was reached after 4 days. Margaret traveled in A. William and the others guarded the wagon as Marcus Flynn drove it. Margaret kept to herself on the long road, staring at the mountains with a blank face. She stayed awake by the campfire and didn't eat much while the men watched. Night stops made her sleep less. On the 3rd night of their trip, Margaret finally spoke in a tall pine clearing. Nothing. She requested a private conversation with William. William hesitated but agreed. He stood so the other men could see them but not hear them. Margaret's soft voice was hard to hear over the fire and forest at night. Now, in Marshall, she told William she would be hanged and there was no escape. However, she wanted to tell the truth before lawyers, juries, and the justice system changed her story. Changed into something else. William warned Margaret that anything she said could be used against her in court, but Margaret ignored him. She said she no longer cared what the law said because she had kept too many heavy secrets for too long, sounding strangely relieved. Margaret confessed her life before marrying Daniel Crow. She was poor and from Virginia. Her tenant farmer father drank. When angry, he beat his wife and kids hard. Margaret quickly learned that women were property passed from father to husband in that society and had few options. She could only feel safe with a rich man who wouldn't leave her poor. She married Daniel at 21. She liked him because he was a stable businessman, not romantically. It was fine for the first few years, but not great. Daniel was polite but cold, more concerned with business than wife. Margaret began helping him with the books and discovered her math and business skills. She became vital to his business, but she couldn't legally take any of the profits. Margaret was scared for the first time when Daniel discussed changing his will to leave everything to nephews he barely knew, and leaving her almost completely out. She worked hard for years of her life to build his business. She worried about losing everything when he died. Her initial intent was not to kill him. She started to imagine her life without him, and how much better it would be if she could keep everything she helped build. Any farm store or pharmacy sold arsenic. Margaret started by adding small amounts of medicine to Daniel's food. Not enough to kill him, just enough to make him sick and need her help. In these weeks of being sick but under control, she gently advised him to change his will because leaving his loving wife without money would be shameful. Daniel changed his will because he was weak and appreciated her attention. Janet told William she would stop poisoning Daniel after the new will was signed to save him. Daniel casually mentioned during one of their bedside conversations that he considered consulting another lawyer because he wasn't sure he'd made the right choice. Margaret feared. She realized years of planning and work were about to fail. That night, she gave Daniel a lot more arsenic, enough to kill him in a few days. Although the investigation scared her, she remained calm and answered questions as a grieving widow. Margaret felt free when the case was dropped for lack of evidence. She believed she could finally live. Her evil deeds saved her. But guilt was always there, and Richmonder's suspicious looks made every day painful. Margaret confirmed William's thoughts about Richmond's 3 missing men. Albert Morrison found Daniel's business records flawed. Margaret caused trouble there to get money before Daniel died. Albert yelled at her and threatened to report her to the police. Margaret invited him. After discussing a deal, they served him strychnine-laced wine at dinner. He died in her house and was buried under basement floorboards. Charles Peaton changed. Margaret briefly considered marrying him before deciding against it. Margaret enjoyed the good life and didn't want to return to poverty because Charles only received a small military pension. Charles' marriage proposal terrified Maggie. Her marriage was contingent on telling him the truth. From her past, she poisoned him because she couldn't refuse without making him suspicious. His body was buried in the same dirty cellar with arsenic in the tea. Theodore Blackwell was confusing. He was helping Margaret sell her Richmond homes when he began to question where some of the money came from, why some documents didn't match, and why her story didn't make sense. Margaret could tell Theodore was losing faith in her. He would eventually proceed. This was unacceptable, especially since she almost left Richmond with all her money. She murdered Theodore last in Richmond. He was poisoned and buried with the others. Margaret said she sold her Richmond house after killing Theodore so no one could search the basement for bodies. They didn't need to dig under the floorboards, so the new owners probably hadn't found them. Since she wanted to start over somewhere no one knew her, the Appalachians were her only option. Margaret confessed all night. Her words flowed like repressed water. William listened quietly. He asked a few questions to learn more, but mostly let her tell her story. The other men in the escort kept their distance, but William saw Marcus Flynn occasionally look at him, anxiously toward him, clearly interested in their conversation. Margaret explained that she was moving to Madison to start over. She planned to live off her crime money, so to maintain appearances and slowly integrate into the community. The first few months of that plan seemed good. After John Patterson arrived, things broke down again. John Patterson didn't sell spices. He told Sarah Pritchard. Theodore Blackwell's family hired him as a private investigator because they never believed he had gone missing or committed a crime. Patterson discovered Theodore's connection to Margaret after being hired by his family to investigate his disappearance. Patterson followed her trail from Richmond to the Appalachians. The Margaret's cabin door was found after months of careful research. Knocked on the door. Patterson. On that cold November afternoon, Margaret didn't recognize him at the door. For warmth in the cool mountain air, she invited him in and gave him hot tea. Patterson revealed who he was and his purpose during their conversation. He informed her that he knew Theodore Blackwell and had proof that Margaret was related to the missing lawyer. He also promised to bring her to Richmond for justice. Maggie was scared again. Everything she worked for. This investigator wanted to destroy the lives she gave for her safety and freedom. She gave Patterson some time to consider her options. Patterson probably believed she was considering quitting peacefully when she agreed. Instead, she made arsenic-laced tea in her trunk under the floorboards. Patterson drank the poisonous tea and felt sick within an hour. Margaret watched with a mix of... She watched him suffer in horror and resignation, knowing she had crossed another line she could not cross again. After Patterson died, she dragged his body down the mountain to Marshall in the dark. She hid the body in Solomon Green's storehouse in winter because it wasn't used. She exploited the moonless night in quiet village streets. Margaret thought she had escaped again. Patterson died long before her spring body was found. Then Thomas Whitfield and Reverend Morrison fueled rumors. Community disapproval grew quickly and couldn't be ignored. Margaret had to flee again faster than planned before the snow melted and the trails were easy to walk on. Margaret burned all evidence of her crimes the night before she left. She wrote in notebooks. The money she got from the men she killed, the fabrics she stole from Patterson's house before hiding his body because she planned to use them but realized too late that they could be used against her, and even pieces of her own hair she cut in desperation. She left the cabin early in the morning with only the things she needed and followed the back trails she had learned after months there, thinking she could hide her identity by changing her appearance. End of story. Margaret traveled south through the mountains, avoiding main roads and buying food in small towns where no one would have heard about Madison. 3 weeks passed before she felt safe enough to settle in Murphy again. This time, she was Sarah Mitchell. The months in Murphy were the calmest Margaret had felt since Daniel Crow's death. She worked honestly, went to church, and made real friends with people who only knew her as the quiet seamstress. Their origin was north. She wondered if she could leave the past behind and live a peaceful life, but she knew someone would find her. William Dockery at the door made Margaret feel better. She was exhausted from keeping so many secrets, being on guard, and never being able to trust or connect with others. It was different before. Expected when she started that bad path years ago. Even hanging from a gallows, facing justice gave a sense of freedom. William was silent after Margaret confessed. The woman in front of him, lit by the flickering fire, seemed calm and sensible. So he tried to figure out how she could have done the horrible things she described. She didn't look like a monster or crazy. He subconsciously expected someone who could kill multiple people. It was obvious she was exhausted. He asked Margaret if she regretted killing the men. Margaret deliberated before answering. She regretted what she did to Daniel because he was a good person and didn't deserve it. She said she was mostly pragmatic about others. They threatened her freedom and safety, so she killed them, like eliminating any other obstacle. She knew this was wrong and illegal, but she had learned from a young age that poor, helpless women couldn't be moral. William had nothing to say. He was neither a philosopher nor a theologian. He was just a cop doing his job. Thanking Margaret for being honest, he told the other men what he had heard. Marcus asked Margaret what. William shook his head and said everything would be shown in court. They arrived at Marshall the following afternoon. When the wagon arrived, almost the entire village was there because Margaret Crow was being brought back. The woman who had frightened the quiet community was insulted and threatened. She was attracting morbid curiosity from others. William had his men form a protective circle to help him. Safely transport Margaret to the courthouse basement jail cell. Margaret Crow was imprisoned in a small, damp cell with stone walls that leaked water and a narrow window near the ceiling that let in little light. William gave them a straw-matted wooden bed, a bucket for necessities, and 3 meals a day from Henry Bolton's tavern. Margaret didn't complain and read the prayer or sat quietly. Murphy gave her a book. The trial was scheduled for early September 1898, giving time to call witnesses and gather evidence. Henry Ashwood, the prosecutor, used Margaret's confession to William, her cabin's evidence, and John Patterson's body to build a strong case. Margaret's defense was handled by young Asheville lawyer Robert Mercer. He accepted the case when no other local lawyers would. Robert said Margaret's confession was forced emotionally during a hard journey. The physical evidence was weak, and Patterson's body could have reached Solomon's warehouse another way. He didn't seem interested in the case, and his objections were weak and easy for the prosecution to overcome. The Madison County jury of 12 men found the man guilty of first-degree murder in under 2 hours. The sentence was handed down by 67-year-old North Carolina Judge Cornelius Watkins. 7 months after Josiah Hriss found her abandoned cabin, he told Margaret Crow she would be hanged on October 28, 1898. Judge Watkins sentenced Margaret seriously, saying her actions were a breach of trust and required the maximum punishment to be fair. Mary Ann heard the sentence emotionlessly. She stood up and spoke loudly in the courtroom when the judge asked her if she had anything to say before being taken back to her cell. She believed her sentence was fair for her crimes, but she hoped it would demonstrate how difficult it is for women to live in a society that denies them most rights and opportunities. Not for forgiveness. She just wanted to know. Desperate people make bad choices. Margaret's statement elicited mixed reactions in court. Some saw them as deceptive attempts to pity them. Others saw an uncomfortable truth about women's lives. Margaret was sentenced to death, regardless of public opinion. Margaret's cell had unexpected visitors after the trial. Sarah Pritchard brought wildflowers and compliments. While she could, she said, she didn't excuse Margaret's actions, but she saw the woman who had admitted how hard living alone in a dangerous world is. Emma Hendress, driven by Christian compassion and morbid curiosity, joined them. She brought Margaret home-cooked food and sat with her for an hour, talking about unimportant things without mentioning the crimes or execution. Reverend Ezekiel Morrison visited Margaret for another reason. He assisted her. Soul, to help her repent and accept Jesus Christ before it was too late. Margaret patiently listened, but after his passionate sermon she whispered that she had accepted her fate and did not need religious help. The minister left angry but unsurprised. He had met many stubborn people in his years as a minister. William Dockery visited Margaret frequently in those final weeks. He felt strangely responsible for her since he heard her, to catch her and listen. They discussed everyday topics like the seasons changing outside their small cell window and places they had been. William found Margaret smart, well-spoken, and interesting about politics, literature, and people despite her terrible deeds. Margaret requested something odd during one visit. She requested that William write to Richmond police about the three's location. buried bodies in their former basement. Margaret said these families had the right to know what happened to their loved ones and bury them properly. William agreed because he knew it was the least he could do to reassure longtime victims. The bodies of Albert Morrison, Charles Peaton, and Theodore Blackwell were found where Margaret said they would be a few weeks later. It was families. People were informed, bodies were buried properly, and justice was served. The news confirmed Margaret Crowe killed at least 6 people over 15 years. She became one of North Carolina's most prolific serial killers. Cold and clear, the 28th of October morning saw frost on the courthouse grass and a blue sky. Gallows were set. A simple but useful thick wood structure was in the building's back courtyard. The executioner was waiting on a platform after 13 steps. About 300 people watched the execution. Since the case was famous, most were from nearby counties, not Marshall. Margaret was taken from her cell at 9 a.m. Sarah Pritchard brought her a simple gray cotton dress, and she bunched her hair. With her hands tied behind her back, she walked with honor and straightness. William Dockery led her to the gallows and offered to hold her hand up the 13 steps. Every step echoed in the quiet courtyard. Judge Watkins repeated the sentence from the platform. After that, he asked Margaret for any final remarks. As she looked out over the crowd and saw familiar and unfamiliar faces, her voice never wavered. She stated she regretted her actions and knew they were unforgivable. She bravely faced her fate. She concluded that the mountains have many secrets, and that hers would be revealed after she died. A black hood was placed over her head and the rope around her neck was tightened. Margaret Crowe fell through the trap door when the killer pulled the lever. Her fall broke her neck instantly, killing her. The corpse hung for 20 minutes, as required by law before being lowered and checked by Dr. Benjamin Clark. Because Margaret was buried in Marshall Cemetery's executed criminal section, there is no headstone. She had only a wooden stake with a number on her grave. However, for years after she died, people saw a woman walking up Mount Mitchell at dusk, always toward the empty cabin that was never lived in. Margaret's home was there. 3 more years passed before it fell during a harsh winter due to snowfall. After the building fell, the trees grew over it. After over a century, the terrible event's site is almost unrecognizable. Just a mossy stone foundation and faded memories in dusty county records. Margaret Crowe affected Marshall and Madison County for years. Locals became wary of outsiders, more aware of rule-breaking. More subtle lessons included the pressures lonely women face, how society can make desperate people, and how important it is to be compassionate and alert. William Dockery resigned as sheriff after 12 years, but he never forgot Margaret Crowe. He kept all his case notes in a notebook and read it again on quiet nights to figure out how a seemingly simple occurrence happened. A sane person could explain the deaths. He never gave a good answer, only saying that human nature has complex layers. Sarah Pritchard resumed running her boarding house and eventually regained some of the business she lost to the affair. She kept Margaret's picture in her desk drawer and looked at it occasionally to remember their conversations about survival and solitude. Last, Emma Hendricks stopped having. Though she had nightmares, she could never look at the cabin's hillside without chills. Thus, Margaret Crowe's story goes from a living memory to a historical record, from a trauma to a warning. Her case remains one of North Carolina's Appalachian Mountains' scariest. Another scary reminder that monsters don't always hide their faces and can appear normal until long-hidden secrets are revealed. The peaks remain. Margaret mentioned her secrets in her final words. How many mysteries remain in remote cabins or valleys where time never ends? We may never know all the answers, but Margaret Crowe's story shows that history is always more complicated than it seems. If this journey through one of the worst periods in American history moved you, subscribe to our channel for more disturbing and investigative videos. Comment your thoughts. Your opinion on Margaret Crow. Any other forgotten tales that should be told? Let us know. If you like this content, we can keep making scary and interesting stories.